Thanks, Naomi and the worship team, for leading us again today. It's springtime. And with spring, as always, our youth go off to soar for a mission trip. And pretty soon, it's garage sale season. Okay? Now, I have to admit, I'm not into garage sales. I don't go to those things. But picture this. Our neighbor has a garage sale. And his little daughter decides she's going to sell some of her precious toys for 25 cents each. What a deal. And a lady drives up in a fancy car, takes a liking to one of these toys, and offers her 15 cents. And they happily agree on 20 cents. And I say, come on! Really? Seriously? You're going to dicker with a kid for 5 cents? Picture this, the whole deal just about falls if she wants to pay with a $20 bill. Now, my son-in-law sells RVs. Some of them cost up over $300,000. I asked my son-in-law, does anybody ever buy one of these things without actually asking what the price is? And he says it doesn't happen very often, but sometimes. He said, the other day, there was someone pulled out, the first mention of any money was the guy pulled out his checkbook and said, how much do I make the check out for? And I think, come on, seriously? You're going to spend more than $250,000 and you're not going to ask any questions? So we got teams. On the one hand, somebody's going to dicker for 5 cents. On the other hand, somebody's going to spend more than $250,000 without asking questions. Now, my guess is most of us here today are somewhere in between those two extremes. But not all of us. Now, which group do you think we got more of today? Let's move on. Now, my guess is before we buy things, most of us at least, we want to know what the cost is going to be. And around here we talk about the fact that Jesus paid the cost for our sins. Now, I have to admit, I've never really spent a lot of time thinking through what exactly that means. What is the price that Jesus actually paid? What's the price of living in rebellion against God? What does that cost? Now, some people think there's no cost to that at all. That we can live as we want, and there's no price to that. Others think, well, maybe there is a price, but it's not going to be that much. I can pay it myself. Now, we're going to read a story out of Mark chapter 15. It's a little longer than we normally read. But what's happening in this story is Jesus is paying the cost for sin. And the story is actually kind of told matter-of-factly, but it tells us the price that Jesus was paying. So this is Mark chapter 15, starting with verse 15. Carla is going to come and read it to us.
Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the Praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, the King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him, and when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him, Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice on the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads, saying, "So, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priest and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come from the cross, that we may see and believe." Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing near him heard him say this, they said, "Listen, he's calling Elijah." Someone ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down," they said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he had died, said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him, cared for his needs. Many other women who had come with him to Jerusalem were there also.
So in the passage we just read, Jesus is paying for the sins of the world. Not his own sin, because he didn't have any, but he took upon himself the sins of his people. And so if we want to know what the cost of sinning is, all we need to do is look at the price that he's paying to figure out what price was he paying. Now, for the person who thinks that there is no price, this passage raises the question of, why then did God allow Jesus to suffer? Why did he have to suffer like this? And the person who recognizes that there is a price, but figures they're going to pay for it themselves, this passage is a reality check. This passage is a picture of what it's like to pay for sin. And Jesus suffered in 3 distinct ways in this story. First of all, there was a physical part to his suffering. His physical suffering begins with flogging. Flogging was a cruel Roman punishment where soldiers took turns with whips that had lead or bone on the tips, and they beat the person with it. It was not uncommon for someone to die from flogging. Then in verses 16 to 20, the punishment continues on with them spitting on him and hitting him with a staff in the head. And then they crucified him. Normally, the victim would carry his own cross piece, the piece of the cross, the horizontal beam. But in this case, they forced someone else, Simon, to carry it, probably because Jesus was too weakened from the flogging. They offered him some wine mixed with myrrh, which he didn't take. This was a narcotic drink, an anesthetic that it was offered to the person they were crucifying to kind of put him in and make him drowsy. But Jesus refuses any of these painkillers. He chose to endure the physical agony in full. And then they crucified him. Crucifixion was one of the cruelest forms of punishment ever conceived. The Jewish historian Josephus described it as the most wretched of all ways of dying. The English word excruciating comes from the word crucifixion. What it involved is Jesus was stretched out and nailed to that horizontal beam through his wrists. Then the beam was lifted up and fastened to the upright beam, and his feet were then nailed to the upright beam. Death came from exhaustion and suffocation. When you're hanging there, the weight is on your chest. You have to lift yourself up to breathe. Sometimes the soldiers would break the victim's legs so that he couldn't use his legs to lift himself. And so death came through exhaustion and suffocation. In his account, Mark doesn't go into great detail. He didn't have to, because the first century people understood exactly what this all meant. But we might ask, why in God's salvation plan did Jesus have to suffer so much physically? And the answer is because the penalty for sin has a physical dimension. Physical suffering is part of the cost of sinning. And so when Jesus suffered in our place, the price he paid included a physical price. We get a glimpse of what this physical cost of sin is in our world today. We live in a world that has so much physical suffering in it. Violence, abuse, hunger, starvation, disease, death. Ultimately, the root cause is sin and God's judgment upon it. But this physical cost of sin is seen most starkly in the world to come. There's a verse, I don't know that I've ever spoken on this verse before. It's Mark 9, verse 48. It talks about a place where worms that eat them do not die and the fire is not quenched. Now, we could debate on how literal or how we're supposed to take that verse. But one thing we know from it is that hell is a physical place. One day, everybody will be raised back to life physically. Some to go to live with God, and some for condemnation. Hell is a place of physical suffering. But wonderfully, Jesus suffered this so that we don't have to. Those who trust in Jesus will eventually enjoy the exact opposite of what hell is like. A place, a world where there is no physical pain, no suffering, no death, no sorrow, no illness. This is because Jesus paid in full the physical aspect of sin. That's why the verses we used last week talk about, by his stripes we are healed. There is a physical aspect. Jesus paid a physical price to save us from the physical consequences of sin. Secondly, he paid a social price. The second way Jesus suffered was social. This crucifixion is a scene of great humiliation and shame. Death by crucifixion involved being stripped naked. The soldiers then gambled for his clothes, took his clothes, but what they did is they stretched out Jesus and publicly exposed him. It was the most shameful and humiliating way to die. I remember as a teenager going to the monastery close to our house. There was a kind of a somewhat famous monastery up on the hill by Mission. And I remember going there, and in the chapel area, there's a life-size crucifix. And on this crucifix is a naked Jesus. His legs are positioned so you don't see anything. But I remember the first time I saw it, I was kind of offended. It felt offensive to see a naked Jesus. But the reality is it's realistic. It's accurate. The site of crucifixion was a public place, Golgotha, a very public place, a small hill just outside the city gates. People walked by, Jesus completely exposed. Adding to this was the mocking. Mark describes 4 different groups of people who ridiculed Jesus. First, there were the passerbyers who said, come down from the cross and save yourself. Then there were the chief priests and the teachers of the law. In the same way, they mocked him, saying, he saved others, but he can't even save himself. And then there were those who were crucified with him. Even the condemned criminals, as they were dying, mocked Jesus. And then the ruling Roman authorities joined in the mocking, and they put a sign above him that says, "The King of the Jews," which was meant as a cruel joke. And then there was the isolation that Jesus experienced. Almost everyone was against him. He was utterly alone and the object of hatred. Why in God's salvation plan did Jesus have to suffer this dishonor and shame and mocking and hatred and isolation? Why did Jesus have to suffer that? The answer is because that's part of the cost of sin. It is one of the many things that the Son of Man had to suffer as he paid for our sin. We get a glimpse of what this is like, the social cost of sinning, by looking at our world today. One of the consequences of rejecting God and living the way we want is a world that is filled with so many broken relationships and all the pain and misery that come with those broken relationships. So much hatred and shame and loneliness and social breakdown and abuse. But just like in the physical case, the social cost of sinning is seen most starkly in hell. Sometimes people joke that they don't mind the idea of going to hell because all of their friends are going to be there and it's going to be one big party. You've heard people joke that way, right? Sharon used to joke this way before she was a Christian. I don't mind going to hell. All my friends are going to be there. It wasn't a joke. She believed that. But hell is a place of total social breakdown. People will be ashamed and humiliated just like Jesus was. People will be lonely, totally alone, totally isolated as Jesus was. There will be no loving relationships or just hatred, ridicule, and cruelty as Jesus experienced. Sometimes people use the expression, "There's going to be hell to pay." Well, wonderfully, Jesus has already done that for us. He suffered in our place. He suffered all this social disgrace so that we don't have to. Once again, we get to experience the exact opposite. If we placed our faith in him, he took that social shame and we get the exact opposite. We get to look forward to a place of love and harmony and peace. Instead of shame and dishonor, the Bible says we will be glorified and honored because he suffered in our place. Now, the third kind of suffering was spiritual. At 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, however you say that, Aramaic part, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" On the cross, Jesus didn't just feel forsaken. He was completely and utterly forsaken by God. And this was spiritual suffering. This was greater suffering for him than the physical and social suffering. At his baptism, there was a voice that said, "Behold," or "This is my Son in whom I love, and I tell you that with him I am well pleased." But now, on the cross, that beloved Son of God becomes the object of God's righteous wrath. Now, in the Exodus, one of the plagues involved darkness. Darkness came over Egypt. Well, that same thing happens here. Darkness covers the land. The darkness of God's judgment as Jesus hung there, forsaken by God. Why in God's salvation plan did Jesus have to suffer like this spiritually? Well, just as with the physical and the social, it's because it's part of the cost of sin. Jesus is paying the spiritual part of the cost of sin here when God is forsaking him. We get a glimpse of this spiritual cost by looking at our world. People are alienated from God without hope and purpose and meaning. But the spiritual cost, as in the other ones, the spiritual cost is seen most starkly in hell. Living in the world today, we enjoy all kinds of blessings from God. Life, love, health, joy, peace, all these things come from God. But in hell, the spiritual cost of sin will be experienced undiluted. A place of total alienation from God's goodness. Jesus describes the place as a place of utter darkness, where the light of God's favor is never seen, but only the darkness of his righteous anger. A place of utter despair and futility and hopelessness. But again, the good news. We get to experience the exact opposite of that. Because Jesus has paid that price. If we place our faith in him, because he's already paid that price, we experience the opposite. We experience that joy and peace and presence of God. These verses read that say that the moment that Jesus died, the curtain in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The temple, or the curtain in the temple, had been there centuries. And it was like a big keep out sign around the Holy of Holies where God dwelled. Only once a year, one man, the high priest, could go into the Holy of Holies. Now, with Jesus' death, the curtain is ripped down. Means there's no need for priests and sacrificial system, that all of us can go into the presence of God without fear. It's a picture of what heaven will be like, where we are together, an eternal future where we are with God himself. Now, when I was a kid, I bought this magnifying glass. I asked Kathy this week, what do you think a little boy does with a magnifying glass? And she said, well, look at bugs or something. No. You burn things. Right? One of the first things you do is, how long does it take for it to get hot on your hand, right? The answer is a split second. And it doesn't take very many tries to figure that one out. With a magnifying glass like this, you can burn wood. Right? On the cross, it was as if this huge magnifying glass gathered the rays of God's judgment on sin for millions and millions of people and focused it in one spot, on the Son of God, on his precious Son. In this passage, we get a breakdown of the true cost of what it means to live in God's world, as if live in rebellion to him. The cost is terrifyingly large. We see the physical, social, and spiritual cost in the suffering that Jesus endured, as he picks up the bill for the sin of his people and pays for it in full. Now, there was various responses to Jesus in this passage. First of all, there's Simon of Cyrene, the guy who is forced by the Roman soldiers to pick up Jesus' cross and carry it. Like him, some of us here today might be involved with Jesus because someone else has forced us to. You know, like some of us might have been dragged here to church by someone else. Then there's the soldiers. For them, it was just another day. Just another crucifixion. They were going to work that day. Nothing particularly unusual or significant about this man being crucified, just like the one last week. They were more interested in dividing up his clothes than in what was actually happening to this guy on the cross. Like them, some people are just focused on doing their jobs, going to work, making a living. Then there's the religious leaders who mock Jesus and his claim to be the Christ. Like them, many religious people dismiss Jesus and his claims. And then there's the bystanders who thought that Jesus was calling out for Elijah, when in fact he was calling out to God, "Why have you forsaken me?" The words sound similar to each other in Hebrew and Aramaic. Like them, many people never really understand exactly what it is that Jesus was doing, what he was dying for. The bypassers were interested in seeing, kind of sitting back, kind of like watching the entertainment, see if Elijah is going to show up and do something miraculous. For them, it was just good entertainment. Similarly, some people today are just going along for the show. But at the end, we read a very different reaction. The reaction of the centurion who says, surely this man was the Son of God. Now, when you get your credit card bill at the end of the month, somebody's got to pay for it, right? Like, what happens if you just throw that thing in a drawer and forget about it? We'd kind of like to do that, right? But it doesn't just go away. Living as we God's world and ignoring Him has a huge price tag to it. The question is, who's going to pay for it? In the end, we are left with a simple choice. One choice is we can recognize who Jesus is, what He's done, and accept the payment that He has made for us. The other option is to pay for it ourselves in all eternity. The sufferings of Jesus have given us idea of what that price is like. In a moral universe, someone has to pick up the bill for my sin. I can't just throw the bill in the drawer and hope it goes away. Someone has to pay. It can't be a friend, it can't be a relative, because they have their own bill to sort out. The wonderful news of the gospel is that God is saying, give me the bill. Let me pay. Jesus has suffered to pay for your bill in full. Will you accept that? The fact that Jesus willingly endured suffering shows how much He loves us. If He was willing to do that for us, it shows that His love is beyond what we can even imagine. It also tells us that sin is a big deal. It's a very big deal. Knowing the cost that Jesus paid motivates us not to kind of do away with sin in our lives as best we can, to be determined to put sin to death in our lives, not to excuse it, not to indulge it, but rather to kill it. It tells us how blessed we truly are. In the suffering of Jesus, we get a glimpse of what eternal punishment for sin is. And we can be eternally grateful. Now, I could end there, but I'll give you a little extra free deal today. Some people have asked the question, how can one man on the cross for 6 hours or so, how can that pay for the sins of billions of people, eternal punishment? So here you've got one man, here you got billions of people, here you got hours, here you got years and years, endless years, eternity. How does this equal that? How can this pay for that? Have you ever thought of that? Like how does one man dying, how does that pay for billions of people? A few hours versus eternity. How does that math work out? Well, here's my attempt at an answer. And partly I'm going to say we never fully understand this. But it has to do with the value of the sacrifice. The dignity and worth of the person being sacrificed. Let me give you an illustration that will maybe help you understand this. Some of you into fishing, right? Go fishing? Some of you? When we go fishing, you put a worm on a hook, right? Some of you might be a little grossed out by that. But no big moral outrage. You don't see PETA protesting fishermen putting worms on hooks. Right? Okay, same action, little bigger hook, but now it's a cat. Okay, see the reaction? See the reaction? Now a moral outrage is starting to happen inside us. Okay, up the ante a little bit, and now it's a human being on that hook. Now there's moral outrage. What you have dying here is the eternal Son of God. the God-man. The worth of that sacrifice, his death, spread over hours, is more than enough to pay for billions and billions of people for eternity. It's the value of the sacrifice. Do you understand? That's what we are giving thanks for. The value of the sacrifice. It's not just for you and me and the couple hundred people here. It's for billions and billions of people throughout all the history of the world. And he took everything, physical, social, spiritual, and he paid it all. More than enough. We want to remember that today by taking the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper kind of focuses more on the physical part of the suffering. The bread symbolizes his body as broken for us. The juice symbolizes his blood that was shed for us. When we take communion, it's a time for us to reflect back and say, okay, where am I in my relationship with God? When I take communion, what I am saying is I am coming under what Jesus has done for me. I am accepting what he has, the price that he paid. I can't pay this. But I'm accepting that Jesus has paid it for me. And as we get to understand greater detail what that price was, we become more and more grateful. Working through this sermon and what the price is that Jesus paid has made me far more grateful. I can understand maybe for the first time more of what he actually paid. And so this morning we want to take communion. And as we do it, we want to thank God. Thank Jesus for what he has done.